The tranquility of the evening was shattered by a sudden, aggressive pounding on the door, a sound that echoed through the house like the crack of a judge's gavel, signaling a verdict Thierry Dupont could never have anticipated. But before we begin, I want to ask you something. Are you ready to hear a story that might change the way you see life? If you're ready, comment yes, and let's get started right now. The dim glow of an antique chandelier illuminated the living room of Thierry Dupont's home, casting long shadows across the room's polished oak floors. Outside, a chilly Parisian breeze rustled the leaves of the chestnut trees, lining the quiet suburban street. Inside, the air was warm and comforting, tinged with the faint aroma of fresh-baked croissants Lucas had insisted on baking earlier that evening. Thierry, a man in his early 40s with a composed demeanor and a strong jawline, marked by the faintest shadow of stubble, leaned back in his leather armchair. His crisp white shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, exposing the veins of his hard-working hands as he held a copy of Les Miserables. Across the room, his 10-year-old son, Lucas, sat cross-legged on the plush Persian rug, surrounded by a fortress of books and Lego pieces. The boy's soft blonde curls fell over his forehead as he constructed a miniature replica of the Eiffel Tower. "Almost done, Dad," Lucas exclaimed, his blue eyes lighting up with excitement as he snapped another piece into place. Thierry smiled, his gaze softening as he admired the boy's boundless energy. "You're a better architect than I ever was, mon petit génie." The tranquility of the evening was shattered by a sudden, aggressive pounding on the front door. The sound reverberated through the house, startling Lucas, who dropped his Lego pieces, sending them clattering to the floor. Thierry's expression darkened. He set his book aside and rose to his feet, the creases in his forehead deepening as he approached the door. The pounding persisted, more insistent this time. Lucas scrambled to his feet, clutching his father's hand. "Guidamment di qui sti tespenisi veton di kipenar no kitie cretan bon." "Stay behind me," Thierry instructed firmly, his voice steady but taut with unease. He opened the door to reveal a squad of uniformed police officers standing under the flickering yellow streetlight. At the forefront was Captain Pierre Dubois, a stern man with silvering temples and a rigid stance. Behind him, two other officers bore an unmistakable expression of hostility. "Thierry Dupont," Dubois announced, his voice cold and authoritative. "You are under arrest for corruption and conspiracy." Lucrane ran to him, tears filled with ratio to her own devastating beauty, as bright as Hope May in the morning, his muscular frame growing tangible behind her. He reached out, breathing hard, and climbed to her lap to bury himself under the weight of her arms. He took a step back, instinctively shielding Lucas with his arm. "This is a mistake," Thierry said, his voice steady but laced with indignation. "I demand to know the basis for these accusations." Dubois' lips pressed into a thin line. "The charges will be explained at the station. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Lucas's small hand tightened around Thierry's. "Dad, what's happening? What does he mean?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Thierry knelt down, his eyes locking onto Lucas's, their usual warmth replaced by a fierce determination. "Lucas, listen to me," he said softly but firmly. "Everything will be all right. Trust me." The officers moved forward. Dubois yanked Thierry's arms behind him, fastening the cold steel handcuffs with an audible click. The sight of his father restrained sent Lucas into a panic. "Leave my dad alone," Lucas cried, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks as he tried to grab Dubois' arm. "He didn't do anything wrong." "Stay back, kid," one of the officers barked, his harsh tone cutting through the night like a blade. "Lucas, stop," Thierry said, his voice commanding but gentle. "I'll be back soon. Be strong, mon fils." As the officers led Thierry away, his tailored loafers scraping against the cobblestone path, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Whispers rippled through the growing crowd like wildfire. Thierry Dupont? The judge? Corrupt? Unbelievable, he seemed so honorable. Who can you trust these days? Among the onlookers, a journalist, Pauline Martin, observed the scene with narrowed eyes. She scribbled notes in her pocket-sized notepad, her journalistic instincts tingling. Something about this arrest felt too theatrical, too perfectly timed. Lucas stood frozen in the doorway, his sobs quieting into a heart-wrenching silence as the taillights of the police car disappeared down the street. The sight of his father being taken away, powerless and humiliated, etched itself into his memory like a scar. At the police station, Thierry sat in a stark fluorescent-lit interrogation room. The walls were bare except for a cracked clock, its hands ticking in a rhythm that seemed to mock his predicament. Dubois stood across from him, a thick file in his hand. "We have ample evidence against you," Dubois began, tossing photographs and documents onto the table. Bank transfers, witness testimonies, connections to known criminals. Thierry leaned forward, examining the so-called evidence. "This is fabricated," he stated, his voice calm but resolute. "Someone is trying to discredit me." Dubois sneered. "Spare me your indignation, Dupont. You're not above the law." Meanwhile, back at home, Lucas sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the disarray of his unfinished Eiffel Tower. He stared at the door, half expecting his father to walk through it and tell him it was all a misunderstanding. But the silence of the house was deafening, each tick of the clock reminding him of his father's absence. Hours later, news vans lined the street outside the Dupont residence. Reporters clamored for sound bites, their cameras aimed at the house like vultures circling a carcass. Headlines lit up TV screens across the city. "Respected judge accused of corruption. Thierry Dupont's double life exposed." In the depths of the city, Antoine Leblanc watched the media frenzy with a smug grin. The powerful businessman swirled a glass of red wine in his hand as he leaned back in his leather chair. "One less obstacle," he muttered to himself. "The stage is mine now." In his dimly lit study, Leblanc picked up the phone and made a call. "Make sure Dubois stays in line," he instructed, "and if Dupont's lawyer digs too deep, deal with her." The exposition set the stage for a tale of betrayal and resilience, where a man's integrity was questioned, a boy's innocence was shattered, and a corrupt system threatened to destroy them both. In the quiet shadows of that first night, Thierry and Lucas had no idea how much their lives were about to change. The media storm engulfed Thierry's life like a wildfire, leaving nothing untouched. Each headline felt like a dagger, each news report a gavel hammering down on a verdict that had yet to be decided. The once respected judge became the face of public disgrace. His name, once synonymized with fairness, was now sullied by accusations whispered in coffee shops, screamed in cartoons, splashed across newspapers. Lucas, too, bore the brunt of the world's cruelty. The schoolyard, once his sanctuary of laughter and creativity, transformed into a battleground of relentless bullying. "Your dad's a crook," a boy sneered, shoving Lucas against the cold brick wall of the playground. "Probably taught you how to cheat, too," another jeered, their words stinging more than their fists ever could. Lucas didn't fight back. Instead, he retreated into himself, his small hands clutching a photo of him and his father from happier times. At night, he would sit in the corner of his foster home, his tear-streaked cheeks resting on his knees, whispering to the darkness. Dad promised. He said everything would be all right. In prison, Thierry faced his own storm. The stark white walls of his cell were both his cage and his battlefield. Every day was a test of endurance. The guards, bribed by Antoine, turned a blind eye to the whispered threats and sharp elbows of other inmates. Thierry bore it all in silence, his body bruised but his spirit unyielding. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the narrow window, He sat on the edge of his cot, replaying every decision that had brought him to this point. Had he been too rigid in his pursuit of justice? Had he underestimated the vipers who slithered in the corridors of power? He clenched his fists, his mind a whirlwind of despair and determination. "They can break my body," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. "But they will never break my will." Does today's story remind you of someone in your life? Tag them to share the inspiration. Outside the walls of the prison, the battle for Thierry's freedom began to take shape. Marie Durand, his sharp-witted lawyer, sifted through the mountain of evidence with the precision of a surgeon. But the deeper she dug, the more inconsistencies she uncovered. Witness testimonies conflicted with timelines, bank transactions seemed oddly timed, and key pieces of evidence appeared almost too perfect. "It's a house of cards," Marie muttered to herself late one night in her cramped office, papers strewn across her desk like fallen leaves. And someone's trying very hard to keep it standing. Meanwhile, journalist Pauline Martin, driven by a gnawing suspicion, followed a trail of breadcrumbs that led her to Antoine Leblanc's lavish estate. She observed him from afar, noting the endless stream of influential visitors, the clandestine meetings behind closed doors, and the smug grin he wore as the media devoured Thierry's downfall. "Leblanc's playing puppet master," Pauline murmured, her pen scratching furiously across her notepad. "But every puppet leaves strings." As Thierry's supporters began to surface, so too did Antoine's retaliation. One night, a brick crashed through Pauline's apartment window, a crudely scrawled note tied to it, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but fear only fueled her determination. At the same time, Captain Pierre Dubois, once certain of Thierry's guilt, found himself haunted by doubts. Late nights at the station, he pored over the evidence, his mind replaying the look in Thierry's eyes during the arrest. "Is it possible?" he whispered to himself, shaking his head as if to banish the thought. No, the evidence is solid, isn't it?" But the cracks in the case grew harder to ignore. A witness, when questioned further, stumbled over details. A crucial document turned out to be a forgery. Dubois's belief in the system he served began to waver, the scales of justice tilting uneasily in his mind. While the wheels of investigation turned, Lucas found solace in an unexpected ally, his foster brother, a quiet teenager named Hugo. One evening, Hugo sat beside Lucas on the worn couch of their foster home, handing him a sketchbook. "My dad's not coming back," Lucas said quietly, staring at the blank pages. Hugo shrugged, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe not right away, but draw him something. Sometimes hope starts small." Lucas hesitated, then picked up a pencil. As the lines took shape, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks: connection. The turning point came when Pauline received an anonymous tip. A nervous man in a tattered trench coat handed her a USB drive in a dimly lit cafe. "This has everything you need," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Proof of forged evidence, payoffs, but be careful, they're watching." The documents on the drive were a treasure trove. Emails linking Antoine to falsified testimonies, bank transfers to witnesses, and even plans to silence anyone who questioned the narrative. It was the smoking gun they needed. Marie and Pauline joined forces, presenting their findings to Dubois. At first, he resisted, his pride a fortress too stubborn to crumble. But as the evidence piled up, the weight of the truth crushed his defenses. "The blonde used us," Dubois admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "He played us all." Back in prison, Antoine's reach stretched further. Thierry faced an orchestrated assault that left him bloodied and gasping for air. As he lay on the cold floor of his cell, clutching his ribs, he thought of Lucas. The image of his son's tearful face gave him strength. "This isn't the end," Thierry whispered, his breath shallow but determined. "Not for me, not for Lucas." The rising action built like a symphony, each note a clash between justice and corruption. Antoine tightened his grip, orchestrating threats and violence to maintain his empire. But for every move he made, Thierry's allies countered with unwavering resolve. Lucas, once drowning in despair, began to see glimmers of hope through the sketches that adorned his foster home walls. Dubois, haunted by his role in the injustice, teetered on the brink of redemption, and Thierry, battered but unbroken, prepared for the battle ahead. The stakes had never been higher, the lines between right and wrong more blurred. As the forces of justice and corruption barreled toward an inevitable collision, the question loomed: who would emerge victorious? The answer lay in the courage of those who dared to fight against the tide. The courtroom was a battlefield. The air, thick with tension, hung over the gathered crowd like a storm cloud about to burst. Thierry Dupont, pale but composed, sat at the defense table. His suit, slightly loose from the weight he had lost in prison, betrayed none of the fight burning within him. Beside him stood Marie Durand, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the jury. To her, this was more than a case. It was a war against the corruption that had poisoned the system she had once believed in. Antoine Leblanc occupied his seat at the prosecution's table like a king surveying his court. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, his smug grin dared anyone to challenge him. Yet, beneath the facade of confidence, his fingers drummed anxiously on the desk. For months he had orchestrated every twist and turn of this case, but the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. Captain Dubois entered the courtroom quietly, avoiding Thierry's gaze. Guilt weighed heavily on his shoulders. His once proud stance now slumped. He had come to realize his role in this conspiracy, not as a mastermind but as a pawn manipulated by Leblanc. Today, he would set things right. As the trial began, the prosecution presented their case with an air of arrogance. Witness after witness testified against Thierry, painting him as a scheming judge who had traded justice for bribes. Leblanc's hand-picked attorney spun a narrative so slick it gleamed under the courtroom lights. But as the defense took the floor, the tone shifted. Marie rose, her voice steady and unyielding. She began by questioning the credibility of the witnesses. "Mr. Garnier?" she asked, her voice slicing through the silence. "You claim you saw Judge Dupont accept a bribe on March 14th. Can you confirm the time?" The man stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Around noon, I believe." Marie smirked faintly and held up a printed calendar. "Interesting. Judge Dupont was presiding over a trial from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. that day. Care to explain how he was in two places at once?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leblanc's confident grin faltered for the briefest moment. Marie's next move was to introduce the evidence from Pauline Martin, the journalist who had risked her life to uncover the truth. With a dramatic flourish, she handed the USB drive to the court clerk, who displayed its contents on a large screen. "These documents," Marie began, her voice rising with righteous fury, "reveal a carefully orchestrated conspiracy led by Antoine Leblanc. Falsified bank transfers, forged witness statements, and bribery, all designed to frame an innocent man." The courtroom erupted. Gasps and whispers filled the air like a cacophony of disbelief. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. The tide was turning. Then came the moment that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. Dubois rose from his seat, his uniform a stark reminder of the trust he had once commanded. He approached the stand, each step heavy with regret. "I was wrong," he began, his voice trembling but firm. "I believed the evidence presented to me without question. I failed in my duty to seek the truth, and I allowed myself to be used by Leblanc." His confession was both an admission of guilt and a plea for redemption. Tears welled in the eyes of some jurors. Even Thierry, seated stoically, felt a flicker of vindication. Dubois continued, "I stand here today not to defend myself, but to expose the corruption that led to this travesty of justice. Antoine Leblanc orchestrated this from the shadows, using money and influence to manipulate the truth. The final blow came when Julien Lève, one of Leblanc's closest associates, was called to testify. Pale and visibly shaken, he hesitated before speaking, casting nervous glances toward Leblanc. "Mr. Lève," Marie said, her tone icy, "do you deny that you were complicit in falsifying evidence against Judge Dupont?" Julien hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Finally, he broke. "No," he whispered. "I don't deny it." His confession spilled out in a torrent of guilt and fear. "Antoine forced me to do it. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd ruin me. We planted the evidence, paid off witnesses. It was all part of his plan to eliminate Judge Dupont as an obstacle." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Leblanc, who now sat ashen-faced, his smug demeanor shattered. For the first time, the untouchable puppet master looked vulnerable. As the trial neared its conclusion, the judge addressed the courtroom. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds Thierry Dupont not guilty of all charges. Furthermore, Antoine Leblanc is hereby remanded into custody for charges of bribery, falsification of evidence, and conspiracy. Cheers erupted in the gallery. Lucas, seated in the front row beside Hugo and Pauline, leapt to his feet, his face alight with joy. "Dad did it!" he shouted, tears streaming down his cheeks. Thierry turned to the crowd, his own eyes moist but filled with gratitude. As he was embraced by Lucas, the weight of months of injustice lifted from his shoulders. "Justice prevailed, mon fils," Thierry whispered, holding Lucas close. "Never doubt that the truth will always find its way." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Thierry. Camera flashes lit up the scene as Thierry stepped into the sunlight, his arm around Lucas. The world now saw not a disgraced judge, but a man who had triumphed over the odds, a symbol of resilience and integrity. Antoine, handcuffed and flanked by officers, was led out moments later. The same crowd that cheered for Thierry jeered at the fallen businessman. His once proud stride was reduced to a shuffle, his head bowed under the weight of public scorn. The climax of Thierry's journey was more than a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of truth and the strength of those who refuse to bow to corruption. As Thierry addressed the crowd, his voice carried both gratitude and a warning. "This is not just my fight," he said, his words resonating like a beacon of hope. "It is a fight for every man, woman, and child who has ever been silenced by injustice. Together, we can ensure that no one suffers as I did. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a chorus of unity. Pauline, standing nearby, smiled through tears, knowing her work had not been in vain. Dubois, standing in the shadows, felt a small measure of redemption. And Lucas, clutching his father's hand, finally felt the peace he had longed for. Justice had not come easily, but it had come, and with it, a promise that the truth would always rise above lies. The echoes of the courtroom verdict still lingered in the air, a symphony of justice ringing louder than any injustice could silence. Thierry Dupont walked out of the courthouse not as a defeated man, but as one vindicated by the resilience of truth. Yet, The battle scars were not invisible. They lived in the fine lines of his face, in the weight of his steps, and in the solemn way his hand rested protectively on Lucas's shoulder. The ride home was quiet, almost sacred. Lucas, now unable to contain his emotions, sat in the back seat with tears streaming freely down his face. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Thierry turned to face his son, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. "Lucas," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you're the reason I survived. Every moment, every blow, I thought of you, and that kept me fighting." The car wound through the Parisian streets, where the whispers of their story had become part of the city's hum. Strangers paused as the car passed, some offering warm smiles, others applauding quietly. The world, so eager to condemn, now seemed desperate to make amends. At home, the living room felt both familiar and foreign. The air was heavier, tinged with the memories of a life once unburdened. Thierry paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the space as if seeing it anew. The Persian rug where Lucas had once built Lego towers was still there, though slightly dustier. The chair where he had sat reading Les Miserables now seemed like a relic from another life. Lucas tugged at his father's sleeve, pulling him toward the kitchen. "We should bake something," the boy suggested, a hint of his old enthusiasm returning. "Like we used to." Thierry smiled faintly. "Croissants, then, but you're the chef this time." As flour dusted the counter and laughter filled the kitchen once more, it felt like a small piece of their fractured life was beginning to mend. Meanwhile, the aftermath of the trial rippled through the corridors of power like an earthquake. Antoine Leblanc sat alone in a stark holding cell, the once impeccable businessman now stripped of his tailored suits and smug grin. The weight of his downfall bore down on him like chains heavier than those on his wrists. In his solitude, Antoine replayed his own words, his promises of dominance and control. They now felt hollow, the echoes of a man who believed himself untouchable. The world he had carefully constructed had collapsed, not with a whimper but with a resounding crash. Back at the precinct, Captain Dubois faced his own reckoning. He stood in front of his officers, his usual commanding presence replaced by humility. The room was silent as he began to speak. "I failed you," Dubois admitted, his voice raw with regret. "I allowed myself to be blinded by what seemed like ironclad evidence, and I failed to see the truth. But I vow this will never happen again. This department must be better. We will be better." The officers nodded solemnly, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy fog. Dubois knew his redemption would not come easily, but he was willing to spend the rest of his career earning back the trust he had lost. Pauline Martin, the journalist whose relentless pursuit of the truth had turned the tide, returned to her apartment to find it still marked by the threat she had endured. The shattered glass had been swept away, but the faint outline of the brick's impact on the wall remained, a scar of her defiance. She sank into her desk chair and stared at her notepad, pages filled with scribbled notes and fragmented thoughts. In the quiet of her room, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to reflect on the enormity of what they had achieved. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Thierry. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. You saved my life and Lucas's." Pauline smiled, a wave of warmth washing over her. For all the danger, the sleepless nights, and the threats, it had been worth it. Thierry, determined to rebuild his life, began speaking out about his ordeal. At a press conference held in the heart of the city, he stood before a crowd of supporters, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "This experience has taught me that justice is fragile," Thierry began, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. "It can be bent, twisted, and manipulated by those with power and greed, but it can also be protected by people who refuse to give up, who fight for the truth even when the odds are against them. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the hope Thierry's words inspired. Lucas, standing beside his father, looked up at him with pride. For the first time in months, the boy's eyes sparkled with a light that had been dimmed by despair. Antoine's conviction sent shockwaves through the city's elite. Businesses once aligned with him scrambled to distance themselves, their polished reputations tarnished by association. As Antoine's empire crumbled, Thierry's story became a rallying cry for reform. Investigations into corruption surged, unearthing decades of buried secrets. Captain Dubois took the lead in these reforms, determined to rebuild the integrity of the force he had once tarnished. He worked closely with Thierry, their unlikely alliance forged by shared guilt and a mutual desire for change. "I can't undo what I did to you," Dubois admitted, during one of their meetings, his voice heavy with remorse. "But I can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Thierry regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "That's all I ask." Lucas, once withdrawn and broken, began to flourish. With his father's name cleared, the bullying at school ceased and he found solace in his art. He entered a local contest with a painting he titled Resilience, a vivid depiction of a tree standing tall in the midst of a raging storm. The painting won first place, and Lucas presented the award to his father. "This is for you," Lucas said, his voice steady, "because you taught me how to stand tall." As Thierry and Lucas walked home that evening, the city seemed brighter, its lights warmer, its people kinder. The journey they had endured had left them battered but not broken. They had faced injustice, stared into the abyss, and emerged stronger. Standing on the steps of their home, Thierry looked down at Lucas and ruffled his hair. "We made it, mon fils," he said softly. "Together." Lucas smiled, his face radiant with hope. "And we'll keep making it, Dad, every day." The falling action of their story was not just a resolution. It was a beginning. A promise that the fight for justice would continue, not just for Thierry and Lucas, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. And as the door to their home closed behind them, it wasn't just an ending. It was a testament to the enduring power of truth. The echoes of Thierry Dupont's trial reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom, weaving themselves into the fabric of a city that had watched his rise, fall, and ultimate redemption. His name, once tarnished, now stood as a beacon of resilience, an emblem of the truth's power to shatter the chains of corruption. Yet, even in victory, the scars of the journey remained, etched into the faces of those who had fought alongside him. Months after the trial, Paris seemed to breathe differently. The city that had whispered accusations now sang Thierry's praises. Boulevards once lined with headlines of his disgrace were now adorned with articles heralding him as a symbol of integrity. Children playing in the parks pointed to posters of his speeches, their parents speaking of him in reverent tones. But for Thierry, the accolades were not the prize. They were a reminder of the responsibility he now bore. Thierry had sat in his study, the room transformed into a sanctuary of purpose. Letters from supporters and victims of injustice crowded his desk. Each one was a plea, a story, or a thank you, testaments to the impact of his fight. Among them lay Lucas's award-winning painting, Resilience. The image of the solitary tree standing tall amidst a raging storm mirrored his own journey. It hung prominently on the wall, a daily reminder of the strength he and his son had found together. One evening, Thierry took Lucas to the park, where they used to spend quiet weekends before their lives were upended. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine. Children's laughter filled the space, blending with the rustle of leaves. Lucas ran ahead, his youthful exuberance a stark contrast to the somber boy he had been months ago. Thierry watched him, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "Dad," Lucas called out, pointing to a tree near the park's edge, "it looks just like the one in my painting." Thierry walked over, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. The tree stood tall and unwavering, its roots gripping the earth with quiet determination. "It does," Thierry said softly. "And do you know why it survives the storm, Lucas?" Lucas tilted his head, waiting for the answer. "Because its roots are deep," Thierry continued, "and because it bends without breaking." The metaphor wasn't lost on Lucas, who nodded thoughtfully before running off to join other children in a game of soccer. Watching him, Thierry felt a pang of gratitude. Lucas was his strength, his reason to endure when everything else had seemed lost. Beyond their personal triumph, Thierry's victory ignited a ripple effect across the justice system. The trial had exposed not only Antoine Leblanc's corruption, but also the complacency and complicity of those who had allowed such a system to flourish. Investigations into other high-profile cases began to surface, and the media turned its spotlight on long-ignored injustices. Captain Dubois spearheaded these reforms with a renewed sense of purpose. He established an independent oversight committee, ensuring that cases like Thierry's would never again be buried under lies. Dubois' public apology, once a moment of personal shame, began a catalyst for change within the police force. Officers were retrained, protocols were rewritten, and trust, though fragile, began to be rebuilt. Pauline Martin's articles, once relegated to the margins of public attention, now graced the front pages of major publications. Her unyielding pursuit of truth had made her a household name, but Pauline cared little for fame. Her focus remained on the stories yet to be told, the voices yet to be heard. At a celebratory dinner in her honor, she raised a glass, her voice firm and full of conviction. "This is not just about Thierry's story," she said. "It's about every person who has been silenced, every truth that has been buried. If this victory means anything, it's that we must keep digging, keep fighting, and never let fear win." For Antoine Leblanc, there was no redemption. His once grand empire crumbled like a sandcastle against the tide. Sentenced to decades in prison, he became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that power wielded without conscience is ultimately hollow. His name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, became a footnote in history, overshadowed by the triumph of those he had sought to destroy. Months turned into a year, and Thierry's work as an advocate for justice began to take shape. His speeches, delivered in packed auditoriums and broadcast across the country, carried the weight of his experience and the promise of change. Each word was chosen with care, each phrase a call to arms against corruption and complacency. "Justice," Thierry recorded at one such event, his voice resonating through the whole, "is not an abstract ideal. It is the foundation of our humanity. When it is threatened, we must defend it with everything we have, not for ourselves, but for those who cannot fight alone." The audience erupted in applause, but Thierry's focus remained on a single face in the crowd: Lucas, seated in the front row, his eyes shining with pride. For Thierry, his son's belief in him was the greatest victory of all. Their home, once a symbol of loss and pain, transformed into a haven of hope. The Persian rug became the site of new Lego creations, and the kitchen once again filled with the aroma of croissants and laughter. Thierry and Lucas began to rebuild not just their lives, but their bond, stronger now for having weathered the storm together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lucas turned to his father with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he asked, "do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" Thierry smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "No, Lucas, and we shouldn't, because remembering means we've learned. It means we can be better, stronger." Lucas nodded, his small hand slipping into his father's. "Then I won't forget." As Thierry prepared for bed that night, he paused by the window, looking out at the city that had both betrayed and redeemed him. The lights of Paris glittered like 1,000 stars, each one a reminder of the countless lives intertwined with his own. He thought of Pauline's courage, Dubois' repentance, and Lucas's resilience. Each of them had been a root anchoring him when the storm threatened to tear him apart. He closed his eyes, a wave of peace washing over him. Justice had prevailed, but more than that, it had endured, and in its endurance lay the promise of a better tomorrow. The story of Thierry Dupont did not end with his triumph. It opened a door to reflection, to change, to hope. His journey reminded the world that the fight for justice is never truly over, but it is always worth waging. And as the final chapter of this part of his life closed, it left behind a message as enduring as the tree Lucas had painted. Truth may bend, but it will never break.